Welcome back, everybody. Another video for you. So much to discuss. There's so little time. It's 10:30 on February 28th here on the East Coast of the United States, 10:30 p.m. that is. And just I'm not even going to be able to wrap up all of the events of today. I'm going to just try to touch on a number of key issues that I think are important, relevant, both in terms of what's been happening on the ground, but also in terms of what's happening in the discourse online and elsewhere, because I think that there are a number of things that really do need to be clarified and need to be stated. So let's just talk about what's happening right now. As we speak, the reports are of a major convoy on its way to Kiev, basically to presumably encircle and or lay siege to and or create the final assault on the capital of Ukraine. If this is to happen, this is going to be a major campaign with lots of casualties, presumably air raids and precision strikes, as it were, and all of the usual crimes against humanity that we know come from war. So this is a disaster, of course. And if the Russians begin pummeling the capital, this is really even another escalation, even beyond the escalation of just invading the country and doing what they've already done. So, anyway, again, as always, I'm going to stress that I'm not really going to provide any military analysis. The chatter seems to be that despite the Western media sort of gleeful proclamations that the Russians have failed and their progress has been stymied, it seems that reality on the ground somewhat contradicts that. At least from latest indications, the Russians are on the move. They've presumably taken pretty significant casualties, I believe significantly higher than they expected, but they do seem to be on the move. Major cities in Ukraine, including not only the capital of Kiev, but also Kherson and Kharkiv and others that are, more or less encircled and or under the assault of the Russian military. So the situation is pretty grim from the perspective of Ukraine's military, and this is despite the sort of heroics that we've kind of come to read about in the last few days in the corporate press here in the West. The heroics of Zelensky, the heroics of average Ukrainians, and I don't mean to even remotely condescend to their experiences, because of course it is absolutely heroic defense, not only of their country, but more importantly of themselves, their families, their loved ones, their children, etc. So um, this is something that we need to be mindful of, that while on the one hand, sort of this sort of heroic defense of Ukraine, on the other hand, the reality is that a lot of people are going to die here, and it could potentially get very ugly, and we don't need to be kind of sideline cheerleaders. And I guess that would lead me to the next point that I want to make. Well, actually, I'm going to hold off on that for 1 second and just talk about the negotiations. Supposedly, the negotiations ended with nothing having been accomplished. The Ukrainian side seems to feel that no tangible progress was made. It seems like the Russians feel that, at least from the initial stages, that this was not necessarily good faith discussion. So the latest I've seen on that, as of a couple of hours ago, was that confirmation that a Russian delegation had returned from Moscow to Belarus for additional talks. So I suppose what can we say other than it remains our our job to be somewhat hopeful and optimistic that diplomacy can prevail and some kind of peace, even at least at the very least a ceasefire, which again that seems to be one of the two aspects of this negotiation: ceasefire negotiation and also potential negotiation for an end to the conflict. We'll see. We'll see what happens there. It's not entirely clear whether Zelensky feels that he has to make a deal, whether he has to make a deal right now. What's going to happen if the Russians steamroll into Kiev. I mean, they haven't steamrolled as of yet, but then again, it doesn't seem that they've been deploying, significant resources, at least significant in the way of their overall military and their overall capabilities. It does seem, at least from my non military perspective, that the Russians have been holding back quite a lot. And I would imagine it's partially in hopes of reducing civilian casualties and partially in hopes of sort of achieving a quick and easy and cheap victory. But it doesn't seem to be the case for them. Now, moving on, I want to just make another point that I think is really worth repeating. And actually, I'm going to drink some water before I do that because it really requires reiterating over and over again. NATO is a criminal organization. There is zero call to ever support NATO or to cheer for NATO or to pretend that it is not responsible for the destruction of several countries, for carrying out innumerable war crimes over multiple decades. Let us not forget that NATO destroyed Serbia and Kosovo, that NATO is the force responsible for a 20-year occupation in Afghanistan, that NATO is responsible for the destruction of Libya, that NATO has innumerable war crimes to its name, and that NATO is not at all blameless in escalating all of this particular conflict over Ukraine to this point. And I think we have to be really, really, really clear about this, because anybody who's coming along and latching on to what I might be saying or what others might be saying and who are getting some value in what we're saying, then please be very, very clear about where I stand and where people like me stand, left anti imperialists who really, truly believe in opposing imperialist wars, whether they are US wars or Russian wars or what have you. Okay. And we have to be very clear and honest about the situation. And NATO is not our friend. NATO is not our ally. NATO is a criminal organization. In this case, Russia has committed a war crime here, but NATO has committed innumerable war crimes. And let's be very clear about that. Um, all right. I think that to segue from that point, it really does bear repeating that we are now seeing escalations from Europe, escalation of this crisis. And this is very odd considering how little one normally thinks in the great power politics and, whatever, about countries like the Netherlands and Slovakia and Poland. But countries like the Netherlands and Slovakia and Poland are now providing material military support to the Ukrainian military. This escalates the conflict and directly involves them in a war against Russia, which could potentially set off any number of reactions from the Russians. We should be very, very wary of the involvement of these countries that are not only part of NATO, but that aren't really capable of fighting any kind of conflicts on their own, that are inevitably intertwined with Europe as a continent and with NATO as a whole. And this is an extremely provocative move, and it's obviously not going to go unnoticed by the Russians. And I think, again, we should be very mindful of just how criminal NATO really is. Um, the other danger that I want to highlight here is an escalation that, and this may seem somewhat paradoxical because, again, President Zelensky, Ukrainian president, seems like this hero, this icon that has been presented to us, right? And I don't want to take away from that because he is engaged in a sort of heroic resistance struggle in a sense, right? This is all, of course, some of this is just historical circumstance, just coincidence, luck that he was in that place at this time to be in this position. But here he is, and history has kind of thrust him into this heroic role. And yet, what is he actually doing? he is escalating this conflict and potentially internationalizing it today in a very dangerous way. And if it does evolve in this dangerous way that I'm about to explain, then Zelensky's not going to be blameless in all of this. And what I mean is the decision by Zelensky today to remove all visa requirements for any volunteers who come to fight in Ukraine. Now, on the surface, this would seem not inappropriate, right? That they're looking for any and all help to fight off the Russian aggression. At a very basic level, this is understandable, perhaps even something that one would support. But now, when you think about it a little more carefully, what does this actually mean? What is he actually saying? He's inviting the criminal gangs, the Nazi gangs, the veterans of Syrian conflicts and Libya and other places to come potentially to Ukraine, to be armed, to be given money, and to potentially fight and kill Russians, internationalizing of the conflict. Chechens are going to be there. Chechen enemies could filter into there, recreating a Chechen war. I mean, the possibilities are really scary to think about. And part of the reason why this is important is because, well, quite frankly, this is, at least to some extent, what happened in Syria. And I think we all know how bad things went in Syria. And I'm not suggesting that Ukraine would necessarily go the way of Syria or that, an ISIS like entity would emerge in Ukraine. But the activation of criminal networks in Eastern Europe and throughout Europe, and that could potentially get to Europe, is not far fetched. Again, we're talking about a region that is chock full of weapons, arms traffickers, uh, um, terror networks, criminal gangs. All of these entities operate in the post Soviet space. Many of them have connections to intelligence, from Turkish intelligence to US intelligence to British intelligence to Russian intelligence, and what have you. It is a potential disaster. Now, thinking back to Russia's stated goal of denazification, if Zelensky opens the doors to a bunch of these far right Nazis from Sweden and Germany and elsewhere that are vehemently anti Russian, and they come down there and join the Nazis of the Azov battalion, etc., and internationalize, as it were, Azov and the sort of Nazi components of the Ukrainian military, this is also a disaster, right? This then almost reverse engineers after the fact Putin's pretext for invading in the first place. It's almost like bailing Putin out by giving him the Nazis that he needs to sort of justify this entire thing. It's somewhat paradoxical and yet an absolute nightmare. Manufacturing a Nazi war to justify a criminal invasion makes sense. I'm going to talk a little bit in a second about where some of Putin's motivations are and what I think might be at least one way that we can understand what he's done here. But before I can get to that, let me talk briefly about the economic situation. You'll excuse me, my throat is a little bit dry this evening. Um, it's a meltdown. What can you say? It's an economic meltdown in Russia, to be expected. I mean, I don't mean to present myself as some kind of clairvoyant for having predicted it, but I mean, I said days ago that this was inevitable. That when we look at a situation where inflation was already rising to 10%, you would definitely see overnight inflation jumping up as the ruble plunges. And now, inevitably, the Russian central bank, comes in with extraordinary measures to try to address the inflation. So now the stock market was completely shut. They didn't even open up trading in Moscow today. Interest rates are now set at 20%, which is unheard of, making business very, very difficult to do. And ultimately, we're now looking at a bank panic, a bank run. I mean, the lines at the ATMs in Russia were, very, very long. I don't want to say they're blocks because I don't know, I'm not there, but I mean, from what I understand, very long lines to get cash, but just like we saw in places like Greece 10, 11 years ago. We now know that one of the major weapons that the Europeans and the US are using against the Russians is the freezing of their assets, which I'm not sure that the Russians were expecting. Switzerland, neutral Switzerland, full of Nazi money from generations ago. Switzerland freezing the assets of the Russians, but it does seem that that's what's happened. This is a very interesting development because it raises the question of whether or not Putin is going to be able to access the reserves, his so called war chest. And without accessing the reserves, it's not that they can't run the economy, they can, but from what I understand, it's basically going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for the central bank to prop up the ruble without being able to access those reserves because they need the reserves in order to buy rubles to prop it up and prevent it from tanking. And if they can't access the reserves, then they can't do the buyback. And if they can't do the buyback, then they can't slow the ruble's collapse. Uh, and as you can probably tell, I'm not, a trained Marxist economist or anything like this, but that is my general understanding of how they might have operated if they had access to those assets. So, what it means is economic uncertainty is very, very high. People are nervous. And as I mentioned in a previous video, two-thirds of Russians have zero savings. So those people who are literally living check to check, their wages or whatever it is that, disability checks or whatever they are, they just lost 30% of their value overnight. This is going to hit people very, very, very hard, much harder than Russia being banned from, FIFA football tournaments or, Russia being banned from the Olympics or something like this. I mean, this is going to hit people in their everyday lives. And as I mentioned, if anything could destabilize the Putin government, it's an economic collapse. So there's a very real chance that that's exactly what Russia's facing. All right, I'm already almost at 18 minutes. I don't know how much time I have, but and if I can't finish this all, you'll have to go to the Patreon, and I will do a separate video on this issue. But the question of Putin's vision and what exactly happened here, and how is it that Putin was foolish enough to go through with something like this? I think at least partially something needs to be said for what has happened with the foreign policy and the control of foreign policy in the Kremlin. Essentially, what it looks like is the faction that is more or less aligned with Alexander Dugin's Eurasianist ideology, one that sees Russia's confrontation as being directed with the West and Russia's natural alliance being with China to create a sort of Eurasian, Russian centered, Eurasian dominant imperial system, imperial order. Um, that this faction does seem to have gained state power. And it's interesting because Dugin does seem to be, in some senses, idolizing of and, inspired by the neocons in the United States. And similarly, with the neocons, you have a group of non military men who are ideologues who essentially seize control of US foreign policy for a generation or more and more or less steer the ship of empire. And Dugin and the Eurasianists look at that and say, that's exactly what we would like to do. And it seems like maybe Putin has slipped, or maybe the moderate voices have been pushed to the side, and the hawkish, ultra nationalist, imperial revanchists are the ones, currying favor with him these days. I don't know exactly what explains that, but it does seem that a core group of sort of Eurasian ideologues may have now seized control of Russia's foreign policy. And I don't mean that in a sort of conspiratorial way. I mean that in the sense of they now are the influential, the sort of dominant ideologues in the way that the neocons were for the Reagan administration and then later for the Bush administration, right? That you have a core group whose vision is fundamentally aligned with an imperial Russian imperial revanchist vision, right? And that they look at people like Karl Rove saying years ago now that they are the makers of reality, that they construct, history, or however that asinine quote from that criminal goes. That the neocons felt that they could dictate terms on the ground and make history that others had to live through, right? And that I think that there is something to that with Putin, because what Putin is really doing here is mimicking the United States. He can basically sit back and say, I haven't done anything that the United States didn't do. What was Putin saying just 2 days ago on a speech on national television in front of the Russian people? He said that we have to act because of the threat that Ukraine is going to develop a nuclear weapon. The rhetoric is the same. The vision is the same, right? That the exercising of dominance within a sphere of influence in a preemptive manner for the purposes of protecting oneself, right? Using the playbook of the neocons and demonstrating, at least from Putin's perspective, demonstrating to the world that anything that the US can do, the Russians can do also, right? That here is the new global order where there isn't just one empire rampaging around the world, committing war crime after war crime. We can do it too. And of course, it's a blunder. Of course, it makes no sense. Of course, it's insane. But history is full of powerful men who made disastrous blunders. And we may be living through just another one of those. I have a lot more to talk about, but there's way too much time on this video. So I'm going to cut it there. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/ Eric Draitser. That is patreon.com/ Eric Draitser. You can find a lot more videos there and a whole lot more. Of course, if you like this, then please support the work. And if you don't, well, what can I tell you? Talk to you all soon.